This is off.
On that note. All right.
Gavel time.
You guys ready?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to this regularly scheduled meeting of the Annapolis Planning Commission. It is February 6th, 2025. Madam Clerk, could you call the roll, please?
Mr. Waldman.
Present.
Ms. Butler.
Present.
Mr. Riley.
Present.
Mr. Cummings.
Present.
Mr. Klein joining remotely.
Present.
We have him. We're not expecting Mr. Stakimutis or Mr. Bellamy. We have 5 present.
And I'm accompanied by Ms. Cheryl Woods, counsel to the commission. So we have on the agenda basically one public hearing on the fence legislation, old business approval of findings, and we're going to continue with our comprehensive rezoning discussion. I will be adding something under new business. We'll get to that in due order. Is everybody satisfied with the agenda as is? Motion?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye? All right. Agenda is approved. Approval of minutes. I don't have a copy, but you've all had the opportunity to review them and make comments.
Yep.
Anything further on the minutes? Motion to approve?
Motion.
Second?
Second.
And all in favor, say aye.
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 Okay. Well, let me just do this as administrative business. Last meeting, we had a discussion about the differences, if any, between the words shall and must. All right, and Ms. Woods would like to comment?
I would like to clarify my advice on that and indicate that we would not have to change the word shall to must. To be clearer, we don't need to do that. The word shall would be unambiguous and would mean the same thing as must, as it is throughout the code of ordinances. So we would not need to make that change in accordance with Maryland case law and also the Maryland rules.
Quick question, is that just for this legislation we were drafting findings for, or all legislation?
All legislation.
Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody feel the need to ask Mr. Lyles for his opinion on this, just to get this clarified and set?
I think I've had discussions with the law department.
You have?
I have. And this, what I just said, would be consistent with what the law department thinks.
Okay.
Okay.
I would like that to be passed along to the Building Board of Appeals.
It will.
Okay.
I would think.
Because
Okay.
what I was going to
I
suggest
would
is
think.
a short letter to Mr. Lyles asking for his clarification. But
Yeah, I've consulted.
I will not propose that then. All right, then let's move on to our public hearing for the evening, which is on 3024, fence permit requirements and various changes to the code. Mr. Lashinsky, we've had the opportunity to read your staff report. Would you like to come forward and explicate it?
Eric Lashinsky, Chief of Comprehensive Planning for the Office of Planning and Zoning. I don't have much more to add, frankly. You've read the staff report, and we tried to understand in reading the legislation, without having much context for what prompted it, tried to keep an open mind to how it would be ultimately interpreted and put into use and its applications. And that staff report is kind of the result of that interpretation. We did see a number of public comments come in today about that, which kind of should shed some light on the context for the Planning Commission and the intent of the legislation. I think in reviewing it, one of the things that was on my mind was this is citywide legislation, meaning there's quite a wide variety of contexts that this would be applied to. And that is partly why there was a feeling that it might be challenging to enforce or it would add time, quite a bit of time to reviewing applications So I did talk to staff and reviewed the past reports that were already on the record to kind of understand the impacts of the department. But that being said, I think it's worth understanding the perspective of the community and the sponsor of the legislation to get a full picture of why this legislation is coming now.
What I found to be the important words in your report were the wording of the proposed legislation complicates the standards by introducing additional circumstances and standards which are at once very specific while also still very subjective. Okay? That is the heart of this, I think of the staff response to this legislation. Do you think you could bring our focus to what you find to be subjective in it?
Yeah, let me actually pull. Let me look at the show. So when you read, it's a very brief legislation. There are not many changes proposed. There's a few, 3 new conditions that would be added to, or standards that would be added to this section on fencing in section 21.60.070. When you read those standards, they get at some very specific circumstances, situations where you have wooded areas, a home of the applicant or a building of the applicant is more than 50 feet away from the property line. There's a reference to being 10 feet from the neighboring property's rear window. So these are very specific circumstances. But then if you read the language, probably the best example of what I was trying to reference here is when it says, undue obstructions could include, but are not limited to me, that opens things up quite a bit to situations that might be challenging to interpret. The issue of the topography is another example where a fence might seem taller than it actually is when it's on the top of the hill. It's subjective, but I can understand how that would impact the experience of the person on the downslope side of that situation. But at what point is it a burden or a nuisance? I mean, that's the thing that our staff are going to have to try to determine. It says fences located on the upslopes behind homes may be more obstructive to light and air and should be modified as needed. There's going to be quite a bit of arbitration there, I think. So that's the concern. I think the department is always in favor of trying to clarify and make more transparent our code language and our requirements and make it easier for applicants and general public to interpret the requirements. But I think in trying to parse the intent of this, it was, it sort of makes sense of why this was being proposed, but the concern was that it might actually make it more challenging.
All right, so let's take the 3 paragraphs. The first one is quite specific. There needs to be gaps between boards, 2 inches. Lattice-type fencing is okay, excludes. And shall not be installed on one side by forests or open space. That's not too hard to determine, is it? No, okay. And that does not have homes located on or within 50 feet of the fence. So that entire paragraph is quite specific and easy to deal with? Mm-hmm. Correct?
I think so. I think, that's not really mentioned in the staff report. I mean, fence designs can get complicated. And, we have a lot of standards out there, standard types of fencing, but ultimately, I mean, I think it is true to say that, the spacing between boards is a typical constraint or criteria of fencing.
Okay. It doesn't say how high they can be, but we get to that in the next paragraph, right? Undue obstruction, and that's what you find to be the kind of definition which is open to litigation, frankly.
But that's in the original legislation.
I know.
Right. So we're trying to qualify that, or,
I understand. It also limits to 4 feet tall. Okay, and then once again, the lattice or gaps is 2 inches. And they're proposed within 10 feet of a neighbor's property rear windows, or that are backing undeveloped forest. And I'm not quite sure what undeveloped forest is, but your concern is really undue obstruction. Okay? So what if this were reworded to be fences are no higher than 4 feet, that include no lattice? What does that mean? What is that? If you have like 3 feet, 7/8 inches of privacy wall and 1/8 inch of lattice, okay? I think that needs a clearer definition. Follow me? Fences shall be, rather than relying on undue obstruction, the words undue obstruction. And then within 10 feet of a neighbor's rear window or backing onto undeveloped forest, those 2 are I think are easy to interpret. Is that correct? Do you agree or not?
Yeah, I think those are straightforward. I would interpret undeveloped forest as simply a
what?
wooded area. I would interpret undeveloped forest as a wooded area that has no built structures within it. But I think it's relatively straightforward.
But the term undue obstruction is what that's what your concern is.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. But the rest of it's fairly specific, correct? 4 feet, gaps. I think that the lattice issue needs to be clarified. 2 feet of lattice, 4 feet of lattice, whatever people come up with. And within 10 feet of the properties, your windows, or backing undeveloped forest, okay? Okay, so if we got rid of undue obstructions and then just said specifically, this is what is and has to be, then it would be not subject to interpretation.
That seems like it would
Okay.
be an improvement.
All right. Now, third paragraph, fences located on upslopes. Now, how much up on a slope does there need to be to make it an upslope? Is it, I mean, this is the one that jumped out at me. I don't know what an upslope is. Is it anything that water will flow downwards? That could be 2 degrees.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what an upslope is. So there's not only that, which is not defined, okay? They may be more obstructive to light and should be modified as needed. Those are both subject to a great deal of interpretation. And that's what we don't want. Is that right? Okay.
Right.
So maybe, should be, and especially when there are no homes on the applicant's side of the fence. So why don't, that paragraph really needs to be rewritten for circumstances on which there are no homes within 50 feet of the proposed fence. And so, slope or not slope, I mean, what's an upslope? Follow me? And you don't have to have inspectors go out there with some sort of a measuring device of slope. And I'm not sure what the slope is, how important the slope is. Okay. Those are, I think, are my response to staff's concerns. Okay. All right. I've said enough. Anybody else? Fences.
I think also there's a very objective criteria added that the maximum fence height will be 6 feet. That's objective and easily measurable. So on balance, it's really the unduly obstructive language that's already in the code that needs to be clarified or taken out. I think Bob's right. We can just delete it to make this work potentially. But I don't think you're creating more subjectivity here. You're actually taking something that's subjective already in Chapter 21 and trying to make it more objective. And I think on the whole, this does that. But I do think there's some problems. I don't understand the upslope language either. And I don't know if you want to, well, we should probably ask the sponsor more about whether we can change that or define it better.
If I may, one other point that I regret not including the staff report that I think is worth considering, and it kind of also, I was reminded of it in reading the public comments, that I had spoken to the city arborist, Brian Adams, about this circumstance, and because I was curious, we have some very robust forest conservation requirements in the city, and I was curious how those are enforced when it comes to fencing, because it seems like the intent in a lot of those circumstances is to create wildlife corridors and connect or link our natural resources, which is a great goal. And he confirmed for me that it's quite common for the easements associated with the forest conservation protections to have limitations on the height of the fencing and the how porous it is for these kind of reasons, some of these kind of reasons. So it made me want, and then I saw the public comments, I kind of understood the circumstance a little better, and it made me wonder whether this particular location had those kind of requirements already, and that whether that needed to be enforced, not create additional legislation to deal with this. That was something that came to my mind, but I don't know if the sponsor or the public comments will shed light on that, but that's something that.
Okay. I think that's a question that could be directed to Alderman Savage, which is, to what extent does any of this impinge upon or involve the Forest Conservation Act? Because I gathered from the public comments that some trees fairly mature trees had been taken down in order to build this fence. But I don't know that the property, there's no application. I mean, it's simply to say that an application must comply with the Forest Conservation Act. I don't know if that's going to work. I don't know if that it
I don't know.
covers it. So if you want, I understand your concerns.
Yeah.
Good. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else? Fences and dogs are the two worst things on planning.
I agree with statements that were already made, so I won't necessarily repeat them, other than to add a little bit of clarification language here. When it comes to the forested side, I find that problematic because what one person defines as a forested area, even developed or undeveloped, is not the same as someone else. How many trees do we count to be a forest? So that needs clarifying language. Agree with the upslopes. When I do what are called zonal statistics to be able to measure upslopes, there's a lot of information I need that makes it really difficult in terms of how much land are we talking here and at what slope is the cutoff. And so that is really difficult for any office to be able to send somebody down there without clarifying language. I would recommend that area to just be removed as best as possible. That it puts a lot of undue stress on the people that have to measure that to be able to figure out what exactly is an upslope and a lot of contention around there. Lattice style fencing, that's probably the biggest thing that popped out to me, was that there's what's called triple lattice, and that's not see-through, right? So triple lattice is still this idea of this waved thing, but you can't see it. It becomes, you can't see through it. So the language of lattice type fencing would have to need clarification. Are you familiar with triple lattice?
I've heard of it.
Yeah. So someone would be like, oh, well, that falls within the language here. So I would almost remove the lattice type fencing out and just put what the objective measurements are that you need for spacing and gaps.
Okay.
And undue obstructions. Again, that's an argument language that people would fight over. What is an undue obstruction? So there you go.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have the definition of forest that's in the Forest Conservation Act. It's areas that have at least 100 live trees per acre, with at least 50% of those trees having a 2-inch or greater DBH 4 feet above the ground or larger. We could simply incorporate the language of definition of forest in the Forest Conservation Act, since the city already uses it. But we can ask also the sponsor if he would agree to that.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Savage?
Thank you all for the opportunity.
Certainly.
So I can shed some light. I do have some remarks because I want to make sure we're all on the same page before we get into some of the conversation. And as far as the staff report, I wanted to start a little bit with that because I know there are multiple staff reports attached in Legistar. And although I think you all have received the best one and the most clear one, because some of the others, I do have 2 pieces of legislation dealing with fence, 029 and 030. But this one that you're hearing tonight is the only one that deals with Title 21, which is under your purview. And so I want to focus on what's in that ordinance. And I think as far as I'm open to some of these recommendations, happy to talk with them a bit more. And I understand some of staff's concerns because that is something, it's always a balance between providing too much definition in the code versus allowing staff to have some flexibility and discretion. And, but ultimately that is what I'm trying to respond to, is to provide more clarity. And, I admit some frustration with the staff report because they do admit in there that they look forward to changes to the fence code in the future and that they said significant changes are needed. But instead of giving me actual recommendations and proposed amendments, it's just no recommendation. And I find that frustrating because I put in a significant amount of work in this. It's important to my constituents. And I know this commission's always good about giving me amendments, sometimes too many amendments, but but it's good because you end up with better legislation when it's amended. So, but moving on, what does this legislation do? I want to explain what it does with the background as well. And so what this does, if you look at the legislation, it just adds a section 1, 2, and 3 to what is currently letter E in the code, which is the language that simply says fences and walls shall not be located to unduly obstruct light and air from neighboring properties or public ways. So that's what I'm trying to provide clarity to. And what I'm going to get into is that some of those attempts at clarification. And the reason I'm trying to clarify this letter E, dealing with undue obstructions of light and air, is because there was a permit that was issued in my ward, in my neighborhood, that did not properly factor in this letter E and this whole idea of undue obstruction to light and air. That was something that the Building Board of Appeals clearly struggled with, and also I think staff didn't quite have a good answer as far as how they apply it. And so I want to describe a little bit the scenario just to really explain why I'm doing this. And so, because I think it provides a real example of, again, I think in my opinion, why this is needed. So again, in my ward, we have two neighborhoods abutting up against each other. At one side, there are roughly a dozen single-family homes. The other side, in the other community, is a forested open space with 0 homes, no structures. So one side's forest, the other side are homes. What's in between these communities for the past 40 years was a split rail fence. So plenty of no issues with light or air through a split rail fence. And so what the adjacent community did is submit and receive approval from staff to replace that split rail fence with what's essentially a 6-foot privacy fence. And the issue with privacy fences is that they don't allow much airflow or light, hence the privacy. And remember that this section of code in particular says fences shall not be located to unduly obstruct light and air. And so to make matters worse, since the application did not show the topography as required by code, the fence was in some places essentially 8-10 feet high because it was on top of the slope, which is what I was referring to, the upslope in some areas. And so in my constituents on the one side with the houses had concerns that this is essentially a 10 to 12 foot privacy fence going up in their backyard, blocking light and air. And so I looked at the code and said, well, there's currently a provision addressing that, but there wasn't clarity on how it's applied. So on top of this is that language, which I think was mentioned unduly, right? And that stating that a fence shall not unduly obstruct light and air. Another word for unduly is really unnecessarily. So my point is, and I think it seems evident that the applicant with the forest and no homes would really not have any kind of necessity to install a privacy fence unless the trees themselves needed some kind of privacy. And so in my mind, as a legislator, that was the intention of the alderpersons who wrote that original language, was to, they had a reason at the time to include that unduly blocking light and air. And so, as far as an impetus behind this legislation, again, there was a lot of concern, lack of clarity from the Building Board of Appeals. And instead of trying to get more clarity, and I could say the same thing from staff's point, instead of trying to get clarity, they took a very narrow interpretation of this section of code. Hence my effort to try to provide some clarity, since I think they clearly misinterpreted the existing language. So this gets me to the proposed changes, and there are 3 new subsections. The first one states that the privacy fences or fences without gaps in the boards, which is for airflow, shall not be installed if they back up on one side, the applicant's side, by a forest or open space that doesn't have any homes nearby. And again, my rationale is that a forest and open space without homes does not need privacy, and so installing such a fence would impact the adjacent property owners with the houses much more than the side without the homes. And number 2 clarifies that what an undue obstruction could include, because that was, again, as you alluded to, one of the questions, what's an undue obstruction? So I wanted to offer some examples, and we do this elsewhere in the code. And what I was trying to do is provide examples, and that's why I listed some potential obstructions, which could include fences over 5 feet. I wasn't trying to limit fences to 4 feet high. I was just trying to say fences that are over 4 feet should have some kind of lattice. And my intention with lattice, it's a good point, but my intention was, my understanding at the time of lattice was that it inherently has airflow. I have that in my backyard. It's a 3-4 foot high fence with lattice on the top. Because I feel like that's more in line with the intention of the original language. And so I also listed the scenario of having a fence to be located, like a fence without these openings being located within 10 feet of a neighbor's property, rear window, or that is backing up to undeveloped forest. And again, my intention, because I heard questions from the Building Board of Appeals about this, is to provide some examples of what the intention is for undue obstruction. Number 3 clarifies that fence is located on upslopes, or in other words, on top of a hill or a rise, may be more obstructive to light and air. And this should be factored in to reduce said impacts. And again, that came from this scenario, like I mentioned earlier. Some of my neighbors do have backyards that slope up, so the effective height of the fence is much higher, which means it is going to potentially block much more air and light than if it was just at a regular grade. So those are the 3 main changes, but I do have 3 amendments that are in the system as well. And those amendments were based on some feedback that I've received. The first amendment changes number 1 by inserting a requirement that in the scenario described, which is where one side, the applicant's is up against a forest with no homes, that in that scenario, privacy fences shall not be installed without the adjacent property owner's approval. Again, my rationale is that since such a fence in this scenario would mostly impact the side with homes, that the adjacent property owner with forest should get approval from those whom it would most impact. So the benefit of this language is it would still allow such a privacy fence to be installed, but only if they reached out to the neighbors. Amendment 2 adds an entirely new section to Title 21, and this is separate from the light and air concern, but what this does is simply create a fence height of no taller than 6 feet anywhere in the city. Because during the course of my work on this legislation, staff told me that, well, we don't have a height limit on fences. I always thought we did. Turns out we did not. And so I capped that at 6 feet. And my rationale is that, again, the type of community we're trying to build these days, more welcoming, I really don't see too many scenarios where a fence over 6 feet would be needed. And if there was, then they could certainly submit for a variance of some kind. The last amendment, number 3, goes back to the light and the air. And this one simply clarifies the language by removing neighboring property and putting in adjacent property owners. It was pointed out, I believe, by the law office. So that, I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page as far as where I'm coming from, what my intentions were, or are, I should say. And so if you have any kind of questions, I can get into some of your specific questions if you'd like, but I'll pause now if you have any responses.
What's the difference between Amendment 1 and Amendment 3?
So Amendment 1, let's see. Amendment 1 inserts the provision that would state that this type of privacy fence in this scenario would not be approved unless they had approval from the adjacent property owners. Because again, my rationale is it would impact those neighbors quite a bit, and so they should at least try to get their approval for such a fence.
What if there are 10 neighbors that abut this proposed fence, and 9 of them agree and 1 doesn't?
And then they would have to put in a fence that would be compliant, and that would be one that would have more open space, airspace, or that's shorter. So they wouldn't, or they could put in this case, a split rail fence. So there are still fence options. They wouldn't be allowed to put up the privacy fence.
I don't understand the difference.
Would you adopt the language or definition of forest that lives in, that we currently have in the Forest Conservation Act, which I just read?
Yeah,
Areas
I'd
that
have to
have-
look at that again, but I think that would make sense, yeah. Because I think that's in the same section of code, so yeah, it'd be appropriate.
The Forest Conservation Act only applies to properties that are more than an acre, wooded areas more than an acre in size,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Okay. Let me just ask, in this particular instance, do you think that open area or forested area or wooded area is more than an acre?
No, well, I'm not entirely sure. It may, but in this case, I'm not looking to trigger the Forest Conservation Act, but to one of your earlier questions, this property in particular is not a conservation easement, but you may have a situation where a conservation easement created under the Forest Conservation Act would potentially be impacted by this legislation.
Well, simply to adopt the definition of forest would not trigger the Forest Conservation Act if that was
Right.
incorporated into this legislation.
Right, yeah, I think.
It would simply
that's
be a
fine.
definition.
Yeah, I think that'd be fine,
Okay.
as long as the definition doesn't set a,
I don't understand
Size.
the difference between Amendment 1 and Amendment 3.
so
They're the same.
Amendment 3 adjusts a different, Amendment 1 makes a change to number 1. Amendment 3 makes a change to number 2. And it just swaps out neighboring property and inserts an adjacent property owners.
I can't understand.
Yeah, so neighboring property is deleted and inserted in its place is an adjacent property owner. I guess neighboring properties was too wishy-washy. So
It says next door neighbor.
I think the amendment just takes out neighboring property and exchanges the words an adjacent property owner. That's amendment number 3.
Okay. On page 2, strike neighboring property.
Yeah, it's confusing because it is, right? Item number 2.
Okay.
And the Second Amendment just makes the maximum fence height 6 feet. And that's a new provision. I didn't know that we didn't have a fence height limit in the city either.
Yeah.
Is there a way to further define upslope?
Yeah, I was thinking about that a little bit. I suppose we could, just harking back to the Forest Conservation Act and critical area, they do reference the definition of steep slopes, I believe, is 15%, 15 to 25%, or greater than 15%.
Yeah.
I'd have to look that up again. But we could say, I could either reference steep slope or say anything over, again, 15%, but, and that would probably still capture most scenarios, because 15% is pretty gentle.
Kind of invokes your concerns, though, in terms of how do you
Yeah, I mean, because
how do you
just the
enforce
distance
that?
as well, right? I would just, well, I think 15% is fine. That's easy. Just if you didn't have, sorry, if you didn't have a percentage listed at all, someone could say that's upslope, you know?
Fair.
Yeah.
So 15% is fine. I would just say like 15% within, what's the distance? Because if you, so for example, if you average it,
Yep.
say that they're steep and then flat.
Yep.
And you go, well, I mean, over, someone makes the argument and say, well, over 30 feet, it's not, doesn't have 15%. But if you do 15 feet, it is 15%. You know, the longer you go, if it starts to flatten out, then it brings the average down.
Right. So I guess you could define that, though.
That's what I'm saying. You just define, say, with, you know, at a certain amount of distance, the slope, the average slope has to be, you know, no more than whatever. Or if it is over that, that's where the feet limitation would come in.
It's interesting because the Forest Conservation Act doesn't have any
Yeah.
distance, which that is a good question. It just says steep slope means a slope of 15% or greater. Over what acreage? I don't know. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think these are pretty valid. We're so in the weeds on this. Like, this is so specific.
It is.
But I think that the level of specificity is going to avoid a lot of confusion in the future if we can try to come to some agreement on deciding where those lines in the sand are. I know that's what Eric's concerns are. Like, just to have like undue obstructions is a pretty subjective. It's going to open a can of worms to a lot of like disagreement, I think, at some point, and really makes it challenging for the city to try to enforce those and to keep a level of consistent objectivity from project to project or concern to concern.
Yeah.
So I think that those, I guess as recommendations, those are pretty valid to define like the percentage of slope and the distance within. It's pretty beyond my pay grade, to be honest with you. I'm not an engineer. But politically, I can understand that, and even just the for the staff, the challenges of enforcement. I mean, you don't want to create too much ambiguity for your constituents.
Yeah, for sure. And you're absolutely right. It is, the language to begin with is vague. And yeah, I am trying to respond to a very specific scenario, situation, but that's often what spurs legislation. I mean, it's my job to respond to specific concerns from constituents, and this it came up in a very, clearly staff, but also the Building Board of Appeals were struggling with this language, and so my options are at this point either live with the ambiguity or try to clarify it, right, and provide that specificity, assuming I agree with the underlying, what I believe the underlying intention was, right, and I do, because that was again a concern from my constituents, that were afraid the proposed fence has impacted their light in the air. And I think that's where, for me, it reached kind of maybe absurdity is a little strong of a word, but when I was like, well, it's kind of silly when it's just a privacy around a forest, uninhabited forest, and but my constituents have had quite a bit of grief caused on them in this scenario. So that's what I'm trying to clarify for future. Whenever I see some kind of, maybe loophole's not the right word either, but a weakness in the code, I try to close it. But I just did something similar on food trucks, and it's getting in the weeds, but I'm trying to do what I can to address things as they come up. So I'm happy to consider any other further clarifying remarks.
Yeah. Okay.
And do you think this, even though the city is probably going to work on the fence legislation, as Mr. Lashinsky indicated, you think this would be a decent stopgap measure, giving some more subjectivity or objectivity for the department to use in the meantime?
I hope so, because bottom line, that's my goal, and I think our goal, is to write something that staff is going to be able to implement to meet our intention. And so I do want to get to the point where staff is 100% comfortable and 100% clear on it. And also the public too, to your point, as far as the folks designing and the fences and whatnot. So I can't answer that definitively, but I think I need to work on a couple of amendments to clarify this even further. But I at least think it's hopefully better than the existing language.
Yeah. Gotcha. All right. Thank you.
You're
All
welcome.
right. Stick around. We'll have a discussion. All right. I'd like to continue with the public hearing, and if there are any members of the public who would like to come up and speak to this issue, absolutely. But when you do come up, do us a favor, do the clerk a favor by signing in and then announcing your name and address as you begin to speak.
I signed in here.
Yeah, that's good enough.
And I also signed in online.
You're good. Just tell us who you are when you come up to speak.
My name is Elisa Morel.
Uh-huh.
I'm in the neighborhood where Rob lives.
Get on the record.
Yeah.
Okay.
Your name is?
Elisa Morel,
Okay.
and I live in Georgetown Grove. I think, so I've kind of watched all of this, and I submitted comments, and I'm trying to find the best thing to sort of say to you to kind of reach. First of all, we really appreciate Rob and what he's doing. And, our neighborhood saw this 6-foot wall fence go up in place of a really, kind of harmonious, split rail. I'm actually not on that side of the neighborhood that was impacted, but my neighbors and my friends are. And we did do efforts to reach out to the neighboring community that erected the fence. We made several efforts. I made personal efforts to reach the president of the HOA and asked if we could sit down and talk, just sit down, talk, and come up with a compromise. And we hit a wall. So basically what we're asking is for you all to, with help of people like Rob, to put in, to tighten up the code so that these things, we're not bickering and fighting for harmony in our neighborhood, for green space, and for trees, and also privacy fences have a place, but they don't have a place everywhere. And they're being erected more and more for reasons that don't make sense. So, and I know it's really frustrating, and the devil is in the details, and it's hard. I mean, I come from a family of lawyers, and that's why I went in the Navy, because I don't like that whole world of legalese speak. But, I mean, the devil is in the details, and you have to, and the staff, it might put a little bit of a burden on them, but that's maybe where you guys come in. If you write the code right, it's going to take a little bit of that burden away, and it might require a little bit more work for them to do their job, but that's what being a public servant is about. So, and I'm speaking at it as, not somebody up there on the podium, but as somebody who's, kind of being affected by this, and my neighbors and my friends are. So we really ask you to get it right, and we appreciate what Rob's doing, and it's worthwhile, because even though it sounds silly, like it's one fence in one neighborhood, it applies to all of Annapolis and to a lot of areas. I mean, I just moved here a few years ago from Virginia Beach, and we are just being run over by contractors and by, code not being enforced, and we're losing green space like crazy. And I moved here, and I said, this is a beautiful town, and it's, it's got really nice people, and it's got really beautiful space and lots of really nice waterways. And so you guys just need to find a way to make it work and to protect it, and to help us be good neighbors with everybody. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
No, it's good.
So
No, thank you.
Thank you.
but thank you for the job you're doing too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I hope we get it right, too.
We all do. Thanks.
Good evening. John Tulai, 75 Wind Whisper Lane. And I did sign in and back. So as not to repeat everything that's been said, We are an abutting homeowner to this fence. And when we moved into our home over 6 years ago, one of the selling points of it was the green space that was behind us, the forested area that was behind us that we were told would not be developed. And it was a huge part of our life. It has been a huge part of our life in terms of our quality of life, the view that we have, the wildlife that we can see, but also the airflow, the light, the ability to see the sunrise in the morning from the first floor of our house. And we feel that it's a big part of the property value, and we've invested in enhancing our house so that we could take advantage of this really kind of unique situation within the city limits of Annapolis. When people come to our house and they see, come to the back, it's like, wow, this is amazing. But then this fence went up, and we are subject to one of those upslope situations as well. So now, because the base of the fence is above our back door, now we have a very high fence. So from our first floor, from our sunroom, from the deck, we can no longer see into the woods. We can't see the deer, the fox. They're blocked from passing, and we can no longer see them. We can't see the sunrise. You pretty much have to go up to the second floor of the house to be able to have any view of the woods, except, up like that. So we really feel that it has impacted our quality of life, but also the value of our property. And so those are some of the things that really upset us about it, not to mention the fact that we did go through we tried to cooperate with the neighboring homeowners association. We went through the appeal process, and none of the existing regulations or the people enforcing them provided any help. So we're stuck with this eyesore in our backyard that was improperly documented, improperly installed, and is a poor quality piece of workmanship that is protecting the privacy of trees. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Freely, for no purpose. Seeing no more takers, I'll close the public hearing. Okay. I've some technical questions, so I'll turn to my technical friend. What was the term you used for lattice? What was it?
It's called triple lattice. So triple lattice, even under the way it's written right now, I could build a 9-foot tall triple lattice, I think, right? And then that would still prevent what they're aiming for. So I would just simply recommend the removal of the lattice type language, and I think that would be good. Yeah, so it says excluding lattice type fencing, or just pull that segment right out.
What about excluding? First of all, is there anything known as a double lattice?
You could make a quadruple lattice if you want to. Yeah, it's just.
So what about saying only single lattice? That
double lattice would be. That would still allow for the see-through. So double or single, but yeah, the idea is the gap that you see through, by putting an extra layer in there, that triple part, you then prevent the see-through.
So does it create almost a solid surface?
It's like woven.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So you don't want that. We want to make sure that you can see through it in light and air.
Your microphone, please.
Oh, yeah.
And so, okay, so no lattice thicker than double lattice.
Yeah, exactly. Though the problem even with that is you could just stick the lattice panels closer so that the gap is still very minimal, if even present. I know you probably can't see this, but this is an example of lattice. It's privacy lattice, and you can't see through it, and that's technically double lattice, not even triple lattice. So it's like if someone gives me limitations within the engineering world, I just engineer within those limitations, right? And by saying excluding lattice type, you still could build this. This is a double lattice, just with very, very, very small gaps.
There are other fence types and construction other than lattice, though, that would also apply here. So maybe we're better off trying to focus on like the gaps or the distances between.
Yeah, which is what this says here, with
Right.
less than 2 inches gap between boards, comma, excluding lattice type fencing. I would just remove that part out,
Yep.
shall not be installed. So it's just 4 words that I would just remove and it's fine.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. Okay, slopes.
Yeah, so this is like when you do any XY data plot, right? Like where you begin and end can manipulate the data, right? And so there's nothing that I agree with the slope part, just I think something like 15%
Or greater.
slope or greater within a designated amount of feet, like 10 feet, or something like this.
Your Y coordinates are 15%. Your X coordinates are whatever, 50
Yeah.
feet, 50 yards. I don't know.
'cause
You got to.
if you make it really long, alternatively, let's say you have a steep slope, but it's only 2 or 3 feet, right? Like that doesn't actually come up very high. So I could just see this being an area where if someone says a certain percentage without a certain distance, I can engineer my way around that problem.
Well, okay, I'm depending on you. You have some sense of how this arose and
So I would
what's
say
going on.
15% or more
Over,
say 10 feet of land,
okay,
of laterally.
okay.
Is that,
That would be a.
Now, I want to remind everybody, by the way, in the room, my impression is that, this applies primarily in the first paragraph to when there are no homes within 50 feet of the property lines. In the second paragraph, it reduces this height to 4 feet and very close to a neighbor's rear windows. And then the upslope is a different issue. Okay. All right. What kind of documentation should be required on the behalf of the applicant? It seems to me that they need to cover every one of these factors. Slope, design, distance to neighboring rear windows.
they would need a permit
50
form.
feet, huh?
So the creation within planning is, they would, if they don't already have a permit form that
Yeah.
lays this out, they would just modify that permit form.
Right,
So
right.
that they could put in that information. And there are here, like, online elevation grade calculators as well. So if somebody ever wanted to, they're free, and you just put in that data to be able to make sure that it doesn't go over a certain height. So you just put in, for example, grade and percentage, horizontal distance, and that will tell you the vertical distance of that.
And with 10 homes or whatever, with 10 homes that are along the edge of this property, they'd have to calculate 10 slopes. Yeah, because each property owner
Correct.
needs to give approval
Yeah.
pursuant to this proposal. Okay,
Mr. Chair,
what?
can I just provide some additional information? Chapter 17 of the code does already require all fence permits to include, they have to show topography, they have to show trees, and the intention, I believe, is because you need that information to determine some of these impacts. And in the other section of code, they talk about stormwater impacts, limiting impact to trees. And so I think it's all related, but I just want to make you aware that the other section of code does require
Already requires it, well, I think,
this information.
okay, all right.
Requires the information, but we could set the.
Excuse me?
Recommend to set the thresholds of, 15% and the distance and slope and all that. Like it already requires the information. It's just, right now it's unfettered. They can put in whatever they
You
want.
mean it's untethered to Title 21, it's in,
Alderman Savage,
Building code.
it says the slope over a certain distance? Because it sounds like the over a certain horizontal distance is the part that's missing.
Yeah, the only thing it requires now is to show the topography of a property.
Okay.
Right.
Around
There's
the
no
fence.
There's no restrictions. It just has to show it.
Got it.
Right.
okay,
That's what I'm saying. We
Okay.
can set the restrictions.
Yep.
all right. All right. How do we proceed with this? We have certainly the intention behind this is wise,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, it sounds like we're all in agreement, and the letters that all came in were all in agreement.
Yeah.
That this is good intent.
Yes,
We just simply don't want someone to come in with something like a triple lattice 12-foot high fence and be like, well, it technically meets the qualifications.
And we also don't want to leave it too vague so that,
Yeah.
undue
Yeah.
becomes a very subjective challenge for the city to have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis. The more specific you can be in the permitting process in the front end, the less likely you are to have any type of conflict on the back end, even if there's still a little bit of, I guess, gray area over, the type of fence, if you say the type of fence with the distances that you can have between the pieces.
Yep.
And the slope and remove lattice, we're close.
Yeah. I mean, we have this like within the floodplain management regulations, for example. If you build a certain wall in that area, you have to have you have to have a certain amount of gap. So 1 inch gap for every 1 square foot in measurement. And so these are parts of the code in other areas that would carry over in this kind of thing as well. I think this is very easy just by saying that you have to have something like these 2 inch gaps between boards. Okay, cool.
how about proposing a percentage of airflow through?
Yeah, that's good.
Rather than 2 inch gap between boards, because you get a giant board and little 2 inch gap.
Yeah.
Rather than, do you follow me?
I do.
mean,
That's 100%.
It's just off the top of your head, it's just the idea of a percentage of, what's the word I'm looking for, flow.
Airflow, yeah.
Would make more sense,
Uh-huh.
because then you really get what you're looking for. You could have a 6 foot tall fence, it's a tall fence. That's a tall fence. Okay, so a percentage of airflow. Okay, engineers in the crowd?
I haven't heard from Alex, maybe he has some thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that's problematic.
A
thought we could
percentage
say
of
that.
flow?
Yeah, how are you gonna calculate that?
Huh?
You just open a big can of worms with that?
Why? How?
Well, I mean, you have to define it, then you have to come up with a way to measure it.
I don't know. I don't think that that's so difficult. I mean, you have a 6 by 8 squares of lattice fencing, okay? And you know the amount of spacing between the lattice boards, right? And you can multiply
Well, I
them.
think what you're getting at is you're getting at a percentage of occlusion. So you want to have it 50% of the fence has to be open. I think that's kind of what you're getting at. That's an easier thing to measure.
That's a what to measure?
Easier.
Easier to measure.
The amount that it's occluded or blocked.
Well, that's the
Versus
same as the amount
airflow.
that's open. I mean, it's a converse of that. Okay, but the idea of measuring, though, a percentage of occlusion or
Not
flow.
airflow. You're not measuring airflow. You're just basically saying how much of the fence can be, fence and not open space. You have to think more clearly about how to word that, but if that's, so something like a split rail fence, that's like, 10% included versus a lattice fence with 2-inch gaps and 2-inch boards. That's maybe like, 80% included.
Okay. Okay.
It's just really, I think it's, so my comments, I appreciate all the comments that have been made already, and I certainly appreciate the situation here. But I'm just really concerned that we're just adding, sort of more requirements that are hard to deal with, that burden the staff, and they're all kind of subjective. So I really appreciate the intent here, but I'm really uncomfortable with all of the methodology except what's said in number 1, where if you're 50 feet away, that to me seems pretty objective. But the rest of it, I'm still having trouble with. That I think it's going to cause more problems than it solves.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, if you do like 50% occlusion, that's really easy for someone to be able to look at and say, is it, more or less. I think that if we break it down further than that, it becomes very difficult.
Okay.
Would you agree with that, Alex?
Yeah, I agree. I think occlusion's really a pretty simple thing, and that's about as far as I'd want to go.
Yeah, but I'd make it something like easy, like 50%. What do you think?
Yeah. And the nice thing about that is it doesn't get into styles of fences. It's just a pretty, you're still going to have to, you might start bickering about how you calculate the 50%, but it seems pretty simple.
No. I mean, essentially, it has more air than it has fence,
Yes.
Yeah.
right?
Okay. All right. We will not ask you where you are, but it looks like it's a hell of a lot warmer. Just wear suntan lotion, will you, please?
I'm gonna plead the fifth on that one.
All right. All right. Okay. So, if I could kind of, my sense of the consensus is that we think that the intention is good. We think that the efforts are really a major step down the road, but the devil is in the details. So I'm going to suggest that make a motion to approve, and then what I think we should do is go through every one of the potential recommendations that we have, vote on those potential recommendations, and then circle back to the major motion. Okay? Okay.
Sure.
Okay, all right. So the first is privacy fences or other fences which occlude more than 50% flow of light and air. I'm just legislating off the cuff. More than 50% occlusion. I'll do this, Kim, I'll do this later.
Yeah, and by the way, just Googling real quick, I see that that's actually it looks like it's a regulation that is something that in other cities do as well.
Jesus, how does he find
The-
that stuff out so fast?
Oh, sorry.
How do you, nothing. How do you find out this stuff so fast?
I Googled it.
I was just looking at the same thing.
AI.
And even fence manufacturers actually provide you the occlusion.
So we would cut out with less than 2-inch gap between boards excluding lattice type fencing.
Yep.
Okay. Shall not be installed along areas that are backed on one side, the applicant's side, by forests or open space. Forests by definition of the Forest Conservation Act. We'll get to that in a minute. Or open space that does not have homes located. Okay, so that one's okay. We'll get to a definition. Number 2, fences that are over 4 feet tall we don't need this because we just talked about 50% occlusion or open in the first paragraph, so we don't need all this business about lattice and gaps. Fences that are over 4 feet tall that are proposed to be located within 10 feet of a rear windows. Okay, so that, okay, fences should, over 4 feet tall can't be so close. And we've already defined fences and what's approved. Well, I think we should continue that definition, fences which occlude. Okay. I have the luxury of taking notes. Fences located on upslopes of more than 15%. I think there should be a definition section.
Okay.
We'll define forest, we'll define the 50%, we'll define upslope. Okay, but then there's some real problems here. Should be modified as needed. I frankly see no need for that paragraph.
Which part?
Paragraph 3.
Yeah, I'm reading paragraph 3, the should be modified part,
Yeah, the whole paragraph.
the whole paragraph.
Because we've defined slope,
Yep.
we've defined what kind of fence, okay? We've defined that, the distances. There are 2 distances talked about, more than 50 feet and 10 feet from rear windows, okay? So I don't think we need that paragraph.
But isn't that the only place they talk about
That's the
the
only-
slope?
Yeah.
The impact of the slope?
Oh,
That's what I was looking at the other side. I'm like, is there another place I'm not
Okay.
seeing? So that is the only one that's mentioning the upslope, unless we included upslope in one of the other 2.
And we don't.
but all this paragraph says is maybe more obstructive and should be modified as needed. There needs to be something simpler here. A height limit is really what's needed here. So if it's up higher on a slope and it's to be built on the top of that slope, should be more than 4 feet. Do you follow me? Otherwise,
I think that's still the argument that they're having is that, let's say that you have a house and it's relatively flat here and a house relatively flat behind there, but this one has a hill. And so it's coming up, blocking, obstructing the view much greater in that area because it has the hill behind their house.
right.
That's how I'm
I
understanding it.
think-
So they want to prevent that
The
somehow.
resolution is not this subjective language. The resolution is saying it should be a shorter fence, a lower fence.
In that one area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it's at the top of a slope that's more than whatever, 15%, it should be a smaller fence. And we're already talking about percentages of
Yeah.
obstruction or occlusion. You follow me? You follow
I
what I'm saying?
do. I'm just trying to think of how it works, because if you had like a 4-foot tall fence and then you have an upslope and you're saying, okay, now it's got to be shorter. Let's say you have to come down to like 2 feet and now it's a ridiculously low, weird fence.
I can understand it if the homeowners are putting up their fences in their own plot of land, but in this particular case, when it's the community across, they're putting up a 4-foot fence that here it has to be 3.5 feet, and then it goes to 3 feet, and then it goes to 2 feet, and then it goes, you know what I mean? It's not a practical expectation.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think I like that part of this. And if we focus on the ability to see through the fence, I think
the
that's,
occlusion is far more important.
I agree. Yeah.
And then maybe leaving some subjectivity in there is good.
No,
No?
no, it's not good. It's not good. That's the difficulty. That's why I say that paragraph is not needed, other than to define
You can almost take
upslopes.
the slope out.
there's no difference. I mean,
Yeah, I would
you know
recommend
what I
the
mean?
removal of 3.
Huh?
I would remove it.
I think the removal of,
We don't
recommendation
even
of
need to
removal of 3.
define slopes.
Yeah, correct. I think if we just focus on the occlusion
Yeah.
and the height,
And the
that
height.
gets to a lot of the concern.
Well,
Yeah,
that's what I
don't
said.
like
I
the
said,
idea that the slope is hard to measure.
Yep.
And requires somebody to get out there and take field measurements, and nobody's got time for that.
Yeah. But if we really focus, like I said, on, like we said, the occlusion aspect, that you can see through it, it's not preventing you from seeing the sunset, the forest, all these things, and the height, these are probably the 2 most important things right there. The height of the fence, not the height of the slope.
6 feet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, I think for that first paragraph, where there's nobody within 50 feet, you know, in the wooded area, I think 50% is too high. Something much lower that's more akin to the split rail sort of idea would be better. What that's worth.
I don't disagree. I think that it adds a lot more complexity to make that caveat.
Well, sort of the subtext is that if you make it difficult to build a fence and the neighbors say, well, when build split rail and we'll approve it,
Yeah.
then it gets done
Yeah,
that
good
way.
point.
But, so that's the subtext.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so where we're at is, we've defined a fence, right? And it's 6 feet if there's no, if the homes are more than 50 feet away from the applicant homes are more than 50 feet away, then there's no need for a slope issue unless you decide on a height issue, because it's higher and it appears higher. Do you understand?
I do, yeah.
And that's why I said it's, that paragraph 3 is irrelevant unless you put in slope and a maximum height, given a steeper slope.
Could do the height without the slope.
Do you know what I
think we can
mean?
Do the height without the slope.
Height and occlusion, but no slope.
Yeah.
The height would apply to all fences then. So it's 6 feet here. That's that's proposed in, remember, that's proposed in Amendment 2.
Yep.
No fence shall be higher than 6 feet.
I mean,
Okay. All right.
right to me.
At this
I mean,
point,
I wish it wasn't that high to begin with.
I do
You
too.
know, like, I'm not.
4 feet is plenty.
Yeah.
Okay, but at this point, moving forward, I think that we can make our recommendations clear, and it may be up to the sponsor to make that decision on the slope and how high a fence is at the top of a slope, which we will define, okay? We'll also define forest.
Yep.
Okay, so that's defined, and fence is defined with this percentage of occlusion or not, okay? Okay.
I mean,
There are, and then the amendments, I assume, are part of our discussion. Next door neighbor's approval. Okay, all right, I'm comfortable now. And I will write the findings on this, just because I've been taking notes.
okay. I like it. Yeah, I think, I mean, it's really just how it's written up, but I think that we're in agreement, like, should be able to see through the fence. Fence doesn't need to be too high, right? Like, the slope is difficult, but if we just define it, right? I mean, on the top of a slope, do we have a minimum height that we say that the fence doesn't have to go under?
The what?
So let's say that we're saying 6 feet, right? And then they've got the slope up here. And if we're going to argue that they should be shorter at the slope, is that still the argument, right? Then there should probably be a minimum limit that the developer has to go below, that they don't have to go below that minimum limit. So the minimum limit is say 4 feet or something like this. So if they build 6 feet, but they go on top of a slope, that they don't have to go less than 4 feet.
Well, you need a maximum is what you need.
Well, the maximum is already set at 6, right? What I'm saying is if there's a slope and they go, well, it still can't see over that, I want them even shorter. I want it to be a 2-foot fence there. And then it just becomes ridiculous, right?
that's
So putting a top of a slope might need a minimum that the developer doesn't have to go below that minimum.
Well, that's a maximum.
No. What I'm saying, so if there's already the maximum of 6,
He's got 6 feet. He can put a 6-foot fence up there.
even at the top of the slope.
Yeah,
Okay,
That's
Yeah,
what I was
that's
saying.
according
Just
to
remove
this.
slope.
got it.
unless you put a maximum on how you define where the top of the slope is and
Yeah,
where
yeah.
it is, and maybe in the middle of the slope, so forth and so on.
Okay.
Well,
I'm
and
a little
maybe on the version that the planning and
Yes.
zoning department works on, they can figure that out.
Well, I also think that the lead sponsor of the legislation needs to figure that one out. I think you need to come up with a workable definition of the variable between the slope and the height of the fence at the top, or if it's in the middle.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Do you feel that there's consensus then on what we agree on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So then I will make the motion to approve, subject to the recommendations that we're going to make on the legislation.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. And I'll write up the findings and then you, and then, but what's notable here is that the intention is really on. It's really a good intention, and the work that's being done is good work, and your constituents are well-spoken. They really have something to say, and this may or may not help them in their pursuit of openness. God bless them. All right? All right, we
you.
did our best. All right, I'll take care of that. All right, next. Approval of findings on the appeals process, the stays and all that, the 03324. You've all had plenty of opportunity to comment. The Google Drive has been very useful. It can be tweaked a little bit. I would remind everybody, on behalf of Mr. Pline, to make suggestions and not edits. Just make them right there in the drive, okay? And then they can be easily incorporated. All right. Any further modifications to the findings?
Nope.
Do I hear a motion?
Motion. So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right. All in favor of approving the findings on 03324?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Just your signature, that's it.
All right. I will sign it, and it's done. My old man's handwriting. I don't know why handwriting gets worse as you get older. Okay, that's done. All right. Continuation of comprehensive rezoning. Oh, my God, we have no audience for this.
Yeah, there are 10,000 people online watching.
Oh, uh-oh. I have to watch my I have to watch myself.
Do you want to know how many there are actually?
Can you tell me?
Pardon me?
Can you tell me?
3.
3? Okay. They're probably all fence related.
I was worried we might not get on till 10 p.m., but thank you.
8:30. It's not even
That's-
8:30.
That's fine.
You have an hour and a half.
Good to be with you. I introduced myself already, but Eric Lashinsky, Chief of Comprehensive Planning. I'm here with Casey Ortiz and Alexis Robinson. We're the comprehensive planning team.
This is the new
you have
member of the
not
team?
Formally met Alexis. I'm sorry.
No. Your name?
Press the button there.
Yes, Alexis Robinson.
Ms. Robinson, welcome.
Thank you.
You're here.
Yeah, Alexis is a new senior comprehensive planner who started
Woo!
right around the new year. So, still getting her bearings. But
You have a lot of work ahead of you.
We're, as we've been doing, meeting with you at every planning commission meeting to give you an update on this project. And this has been the most public we've been about our rezoning. We have not done any real public rollout, but we're working on that. So let me, the TV studio is advancing the slides for us. There's issues with the laptop. So if you go ahead and advance the next slide, please. We're going to very quickly review what we went over in the last meeting in early January, so we can get ahead to, we've made a number of updates based on your comments and our realization of the time constraints to doing some immediate legislation before the deadline in mid-June that the City Council has for submitting zoning legislation prior to the upcoming election. So we had to make some decisions about what was realistic. And then I'm going to kind of go through how we've restructured our focus and just try to get through as much as we can tonight. So next slide, please. Okay. I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly. Next slide. Again, just the basic definition of what we mean by comprehensive rezoning. We're trying to find some consistency between the goals of our comprehensive plan, the city's zoning map, and the city's zoning code, which we sometimes refer to as our development regulations. Next slide. Some of the takeaways from the adopted comprehensive plan are these bullet points here. A need for more housing options, neighborhood preservation, inclusive economic growth, sustainable development, pedestrian, bicycle, and transit connectivity, lower carbon footprint, prioritize environmental assets. All of these things can be addressed in our development regulations. That's partly why we're working on this now. Next slide, please. So one of the major exhibits, or if not the major exhibit of the comprehensive plan, is our future land use map on the left. And on the right is an excerpt from that, which just shows where we have identified future opportunities for mixed use development, meaning more efficient use of our land for more variety of compatible uses, putting more uses on shared space to benefit residents, make more easy to walk to places, get where you need to go without a car, your conveniences, your work, your school, et cetera. There's also a lot more green on the map on the left than what you would have seen 15 years ago in our last comprehensive plan. And that was a deliberate effort to be more clear about the existing natural resources that we've protected in the city and develop around those. They add a lot of value to their surrounding properties. Next slide. So then we have our city zoning map, which is kind of incongruous with the future land use map. It has 31 different zoning districts that have just grown over time. And what we have today is a situation where there's many zones that have very minute purposes. And so we're trying to come up with a zoning map ultimately that is easier to understand, easier to work with, apply, enforce, something that everybody from an elected official or a planning commission member down to an everyday resident can understand. Next slide, please. And if you look at the city's zoning code, there are clear directions on how to make these kinds of changes. This is just an excerpt here that we've shown before that really is very direct about what's the procedure for doing zoning map amendments, and that this is something that is expected to be done, and there's a process for it. So we're just following the procedures in the code for this, highlighted in red there. Next slide, please. We shared the idea of creating a new zone. Although our primary interest is in reducing the overall number of zones, we recognize that not having a zoning district that is specific to parks and open space is a problem. where you get into situations where a lot of all of our parks today are zoned for things that really aren't allowed in the parks, whether it's residential or commercial development. So this is just a kind of a simple idea that we want to advance, but it's really the one new zone right now.
Why are school properties not included?
Well, they have a variety of needs. We're trying to make sure they have the capacity to create new facilities when needed. And it's a kind of a case-by-case basis. We can't, they're Anne Arundel County properties. We know from past experience working with them that it's just going to be very difficult to figure out how much of their land can be put into kind of dedicated park space. It's they're just going to want to maintain some flexibility there, frankly. So, I think the better tack is to work with them to ensure that they maintain the kind of spaces that can serve Annapolis residents for active or passive recreation, when school isn't in session, and sort of the zoning is going to be a very rigid way of preserving their open space that I think is going to be very challenging to kind of get acceptance from. So that's kind of the context there. It's not to say that some of the Anne Arundel County public school properties can't be put into the zoning ultimately, but it's going to happen through dialogue with AACPS, frankly. So there's a lot more low-hanging fruit that we can address in terms of the properties the city already owns or they're already in permanent conservation easement. So
I just want to stop you. First of all, thank you for talking about the conservation easements. I know Dylan Lakonich and some folks in the mayor's office are working on trying to make sure we own some of those conservation easements that we assumed we owned, but we don't have the properly recorded deeds. And is there any way at some future meeting you can update us on how that's going?
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure how much money is in the CIP for that and how much, because there is grant money available to do projects like this. And if the Annapolis Conservancy Board or Annapolis Environmental Commission can help out, this is the time to do it, because I think money will be in short supply in future years.
yeah, we can definitely, I'm going to be involved in that work, so we can definitely update you.
Great. I know Dylan did a spreadsheet with the help of one of the folks I work with from Chesapeake Bay Trust, and they prioritized 5 existing conservation easements that need to be deeded properly so we don't lose them.
I can tell you the law office is actually prioritizing. There's a new working group to sort of prioritize this.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, if you can
I've been
update
asked
us.
to be part of that. So with
Perfect.
Dylan and Jackie Gild. So,
Perfect. Thank you.
sure. Next slide, please. So one of our first
Quick
steps.
question, sorry to interrupt.
Yep, yep.
Regarding the open space
Okay.
area, so FEMA, or the Annapolis is now part of FEMA's community rating system. We're, what, an 8?
I don't know offhand what our rating is, the CRS system.
Or 7 or 8, right? Yeah. Do we know if the current open space preservation is getting credits? And is there analysis of any of this progress getting the city more credits?
Unfortunately, I'm not.
Not done through us.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is in planning and zoning. It's
Yep.
different staff that work on the CRS updates.
Yep.
My understanding is they do take into account how much open space within the critical area.
Yeah, so it's
Yeah.
credits are under 420 open space preservation. Just with this and any plans that we have to kind of block that off, make sure you coordinate with them, because the city can get credits and then it saves a lot of people in the city money on their flood insurance.
That's a good point.
Yep.
Actually, John Manassas presented the other night at Pitt Moyer, or actually it was the folks doing the resiliency, but he was talking about the CRS and what rating we have. And so maybe we can get a quick update on that. I know it's a different department that does that, but I'd love to know more about that too, if you have it, when you get a chance.
Okay.
Cool, thank you.
Okay. So the next thing we shared was that one of our most immediate interests is in looking at these zones that either because they're inconsistent with the comprehensive properties in the city that are zoned for things that are inconsistent with the comprehensive plan goals. These zones might be redundant or outdated or underutilized. Or we might be hearing from communities that want to see zoning changes. So we wanted to identify those locations that could be immediately identified. And this is what we came up with, these kind of scattered locations all across the city. And this group of 9 zoning types are the zones that we felt kind of fit those criteria, that if they were consolidated tomorrow, we would not be losing much. In fact, we gain more clarity in our zoning map. And we have to do the analysis and the due diligence to prove that, but this is kind of our initial take. Next slide. And in terms of what those zones would become, we identified these 2 zones, the MX and the BCE, as 2 high-performing, well-performing zones that have led to really good, high-quality development that are underutilized in the city today. The MX is on the inner West Street corridor, and then the BCE is sort of the upper West Street, Chinkapin area. And, we felt that leveraging these zones was one of the first things we could look at to achieve better results in some of these other locations that might have more finely focused zones that we just frankly don't really need anymore. Next slide.
Could I, before we move,
Yeah.
the car dealerships on West Street, frankly, in my neighborhood, do you know off the top of your head what they're zoned as?
Yeah, B3CD is one of the zones that we had identified on the previous page. Is one of those zones that has car dealerships like the Hyundai and the Koons Toyota, I think, is B3CD.
Okay.
One of the things we also found.
It's the bright red in the middle.
Yeah, the bright red in the middle, yeah.
Okay. Is that part of your proposed consolidation?
It is. It is. Yeah. But we also, just say that the BCE has some great features to it, but that also allows for a car dealership. So it's it seems to have been written at the time it was introduced, which is the early 2000s, to try to compromise between getting better urban design. And so you can see some developments that are there, but I think there was also an effort to make sure that some of the existing auto services were not non-conforming, So it's not to say that these zones are perfect, but it's just something that we've realized.
So is there any interest in making that zone a zone that would make those dealerships non-conforming? They would be compliant non-conforming is the terminology, right? They would become compliant non-conforming. Yeah. You wouldn't be pushing them out. You wouldn't be doing anything, right? But what it would set the stage for is that should they willingly move for whatever reason, it's up to them, right? That another car dealership doesn't come in and take over that space.
Right.
So I think it would be a good thing to look over is how do we plan for Annapolis 2040 in a way that we zone things so that they can be compliant, non-conforming, and not to continue the mistakes of the past.
Right. Yeah. I don't think it's a secret that we're interested in doing that kind of thing. I think, you're spot on. I mean, I think we are interested in transitioning some of these uses that we routinely get comments from the public about, why are there still these types of uses in this, in places where we're trying to encourage more walkable communities, so.
Thank you. So wait a minute, what's the answer?
We are going to be looking at those kinds of text amendments.
So what would you do, change the use?
Yeah, the zone.
Move that from the uses that are available in BCE?
ultimately, we do have to look at how to simplify our use table in other ways. I mean, that's just one aspect of it.
Well, it's good to hear somebody else other than me harangue on this subject.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who walks in that area, there's no coverage of tree coverage. You're out in the elements. You walk in the summer. It's horrendous. And no offense, but those kind of businesses that space out the environment from one destination to the next destination make it impossible for someone to walk, right? And so I would love to be able to see a situation where we move towards 2040 with some purpose and speed of purpose, that we zone it so that that kind of, it's not forcing anyone out. Right? That's what I want to make sure that people understand, is that when you rezone an area, it does not force anybody out of that area. It just says that if they willingly move out, that it cannot be replaced by the same thing.
In fact, just to further clarify, the zoning code, and we got into this with the legislation about the drive-throughs. If the use moves out, it's still valid for up to a year, even if it's vacant. So it can't be vacant for more than a year. That's when you lose that use, and it won't come back if it's not in the zoning use table.
Can you just help me understand, like, the B3 CD versus the consolidated BCE? And that's kind of on the front end here. It's there on the kind of urgent list, BCE and the MX.
I think what we found is that the B3 CD is kind of a subset of the BCE. It's like another. It stands for business. BCE stands for Business Corridor Enhancement. The B3 CD is B is sort of a commercial district, and the CD is commercial design. It's very specific. It's not really leading to any change. It's not encouraging any particular type of development currently, and there's no incentive to change. And so it just seemed it's very narrowly located within the city, just exactly where that red group of parcels is. That's the extent of the B3 CD. It seemed, frankly, unnecessary to get the kind of outcomes we're looking for in the future. So
you can broaden the footprint of something like BCE, which consolidates and makes things a little simpler, but then you can limit the use cases.
Exactly. Or the MX would be appropriate there. We'll get into some of that in a bit, but yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Next slide, please. So we've talked about this. Next slide. Yeah, so real quick, before we get into the kind of the major updates, we have a website that we're maintaining. In fact, this is a little bit outdated, this screenshot. We've updated the schedule on here and the phases as we understand them. And we are going to be doing some public workshops in March, April, hopefully March, just because we're kind of trying to move towards some legislation eventually. But then that's where people should look. I mean, it's on our planning and zoning website. So next slide, please. Okay, going to kind of walk through how we've changed things up a bit. Next slide. So when we first came to you, we had 3 phases. I won't go into exactly what those were, but what we've done is we've done a reality check internally in terms of what we realistically could develop towards legislation by mid-June. And that's what I'm going to focus on tonight. It's phase 1, which you can see on the right is plan development, text amendments, and Tyler Avenue Overlay District. That second one I'm particularly excited about. This is a priority of Alderman Gay, and it's something that was already on our minds, but I think he wants to really advance this sooner. So that's what we're going to do. Phase 2 is looking at more of what we were just talking about, this zoning district consolidation, kind of more major map changes. So we'll make recommendations for what those zoning map updates would look like. We'll have a formal analysis report that'll help explain the recommendations. There'll be time for public comment for sure. And then phases 3 and 4 are going to get into that form-based zoning standards that we talked about a lot in the comprehensive plan, but are going to require quite a bit more work to do right. So this is altogether about a 3-year plan, which is actually fairly standard as far as major planning initiatives go. We kind of break it up into phases to bite off chunks at a time. So, next slide, please. Mm-hmm. So each phase has these pieces just to comfort anybody who's worried that this is all going to happen very quickly. It won't. We're going to do all the analysis we need to do to justify any recommendations. And then there's going to be community input through community meetings, public workshops, surveys. We really, I would not expect anything to be successful unless we have significant community input. This is, meeting with you all is kind of the tip of the iceberg of that. I mean, you're a representative body, and we're supposed to, by Maryland state law and the city code, to go through you on this, on any zoning changes. So ultimately, we want to end up with some city council legislation that has multiple sponsors, ideally, and something the city councils really can get behind and adopt. Next slide, please. This is another way of looking at it along the trajectory of comprehensive rezoning. We have these multiple exits, on-ramps, whatever you want to call them, various milestones where we would expect to have specific legislation through city council. And so the first legislation would be related to plan development, text amendments, and this Tyler Avenue overlay district.
Is there any way to move up the form-based, the mixed-use standards?
I knew you were going to ask that. No. I think possibly. I think it kind of relies on how. Here's our dilemma. We have an election in November. We could have a almost entirely new city council, and those folks are going to have to get up to speed. And if that weren't the case, we could probably move much faster. But getting those folks up to speed and making sure that we're doing something they're comfortable with is going to be our challenge. So we could move some of this up based on how quickly they get into this. So, yeah.
I'm worried that they're going to be applications come in.
Yeah, I understand. Again, I think the Tyler Avenue overlay district might help us move towards that, because I think that's going to have some of the form-based standards. It might actually be a good demonstration of this.
Yeah.
So, next slide, please. All right.
Real quick question.
Yeah.
When it comes to form-based codes, are you seeing any real pushback on that?
No.
Okay.
Not right now. No.
Good. Okay. Just making sure.
Yeah. All right. So going through our phase 1, it's 2 parts. If you go to the next slide, start with plan development. Some of these slides were already shared with you back in November when we first kicked off this rezoning initiative. So you'll recognize. I'm just going to review. We have some draft changes that we're reviewing internally. I expect at your next meeting, we will be coming to you with very specific changes that we would like to propose for the plan development guidelines. For now, I just want to kind of remind folks of what we're looking at. It starts first with the purpose here of the plan development. Now, this is a section of our Chapter 21 that focuses on projects that tend to be larger infill development sites. On the left, you can see a range of projects that have utilized our plan development provisions. And they've ranged from the Park Place to the Willows projects under construction. And on the bottom right is Parole Place, which is not under construction yet, but was approved by a planning commission in, I believe, in the summer. So, or maybe the early fall. Acton Landing is in the upper left, major redevelopment downtown, site of the former hospital. But what really I want to zero in on, the bottom number 6, to promote development that is consistent with the goals of the comprehensive plan. We could be much more clear about what goals those are and, what would signify a high-quality development, that is addressing the comprehensive plan. So these are fairly broad and vague, but we want to get more specific. Next slide, please. We have some provisions for bulk standards for planned developments that allow for these developments to add density if they meet certain conditions. So, projects that use low-income tax credits, that's one way of getting additional density. And it's just at the discretion of the Planning Commission typically. So it puts some powers in your hands to sort of make good decisions about which projects warrant some additional density or flexibility on housing units. But generally, projects are able to bump up to our R4 density. That's the highest density residential district when they go through the planned development path. And that allows them to up their density from what their base zoning might allow. But we want to look at this and see in certain places, perhaps there is a reason to add additional density in exchange for more specific, better community benefits. And so if you go to the next slide, currently this idea of community benefits, that term isn't really even used in the plan development requirements. We talk about shared common open space, kind of as an amenity type space that benefits the residents, tenants of the plan development. But we can be much more specific about this too. And these types of shared open spaces, even though they include things like parkways and medians and schools, community centers, the outcome tends to be much more inward facing. The image here is of the Town Courts project, which is off of West Street, Upper West Street area. And, they do have a playground, but a lot of their common open space are just sort of these areas in between the residential buildings that most people wouldn't even notice if they didn't live there. So there's opportunity for some of these projects, particularly when they're on major thoroughfares, to basically provide community benefits that might be in the form of a much more generous streetscape. That's not just like a suburban setback with grass, but has trees and a wide sidewalk, a bike trail, an urban plaza that, could be a gathering space for not just people who live there, but the general public. So we want to be more specific about these things and, really try to be clear. If a project should get additional density, this is what it should be providing.
Why is there such a big difference between a residential plan development, 20% of the ground area, and a business and special mixed plan development, only 5%?
Well, my interpretation is that it has more to do with just the use. You have full-time residents, residential plan development, and so there's a need for more dedicated open space. Whereas in a special mixed or business plan development, you may not have as many full-time residents. But yeah.
What was Parole Place?
Good question. I'm guessing it's a special mixed.
But look how much there are so many more residents than there, floor spaces devoted to residential use than there are floor spaces devoted to commercial.
They went beyond. I don't have the numbers, but they do have.
You know what I mean? Why such a difference? If you have mixed use is mixed use, okay? And I don't know. If you need a formula, it's based on the amount of residential residential space in ratio to commercial space, and then you come up with your common open. But if I were a lawyer, which I used to be, I would look at this and say, oh, hey, client, let's do this as a special mixed plan development, or whatever it's called, which is what the Eastport Shopping Center proposal, I don't know if that's even still active, it's so mired up in court cases.
That was B2.
Huh?
That was a B2 development.
Plain, straightforward B2, even though it's residential? Primarily residential?
Yeah. I know.
That's a good
Anyway,
point.
that's a question. I
Yeah.
mean, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I do.
I mean, I understand the, okay, enough said.
Yeah. So that's something we're looking at.
Yeah.
Next slide, please. All right, so we can go back to talking about plan developments if you'd like, but I just want to introduce this idea of this Tyler Avenue Overlay District, which looks like a guitar shape, or I don't know. But basically the idea here is we have an opportunity to create an overlay district that would add a set of new standards to this corridor between Hilltop Lane and Forest Drive to create an expanded set of housing options, improve streetscape safety, and improve neighborhood character. Last one, I'll touch on what each of these things means. The map here, what you're seeing shows the parcel boundaries that we right now think would be included, but we have not made a hard decision on this. The dotted line is really just loosely trying to just define what this overlay district boundary might be, but we are going to be looking at it much closer. I mean, you could think the major takeaway is that for more than half of this corridor, you have a parcel pattern that includes some very large, long properties that are not really fully developed. They're awkward sites, and there's an opportunity to utilize them better for housing or other community needs. So that's partly the interest here.
I have a quick question. What is this big open space right above the word legend?
That's a good point. That's Tyler Heights Elementary, right?
Oh, that's the elementary school.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Yep.
I was thinking open space.
Well, I'll be interested in seeing what you come up with, because to get anything to get anything changed, it's going to require consolidation of properties.
Yeah.
Which means
most
somebody
likely.
else buys out older people and consolidates properties and puts up other things.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something we're going to have to be thinking about is, our interest here is in, if you go to the next slide, this actually gets to what we're trying. Actually, let me first explain. I'm going to talk about something relating to your point in a second, but just quickly clarify what we mean by overlay district. The city actually has a few already. In Eastport, particularly, we have 2 overlay districts in Eastport. One's called the Eastport Gateway Conservation Overlay Zone, and one's called the Office and Commercial Design Overlay. You can see the colored parcels below are the base zoning, and then the red boundaries are the overlay districts. So what these do, they're a tool, a zoning tool to achieve specific development outcomes in a focused area. So they tend to be very narrowly defined geographic areas where you have specific urban design goals, and they augment the effectiveness of the base zoning. So in Eastport, with this Gateway Conservation Overlay, the intent there was to preserve the entrance to Eastport and the approach to downtown, so that any development that happens within that cone, I guess you could say, is more defined, is different standards. And then in the Office and Commercial Design Overlay, that addresses some very specific properties where there was an intent to preserve historic character of different buildings that were part of the mixed-use neighborhood of Eastport historically. So, that includes Davis's Pub, the 4th Street businesses, some of the former bank, now Nancy Hammond Gallery on 6th Street, and then the businesses on Bay Ridge Avenue where VIN 909 is located. So those are really good examples of how an overlay zone could be used to sort of ensure that certain development patterns continue. Now that's an example of like a situation where you have existing development patterns that you want to encourage a continuation of. If you go to the next slide, along Tyler Avenue, we have a very different situation where you have a kind of a real mix of different property development patterns. And there are some duplexes, but it's primarily single family with large, undeveloped yards. And this missing middle housing palette here of different housing types includes a variety of housing types that are mostly not permitted in the city. We had a map in the comprehensive plan that showed more than 60% of the residential zoned areas of the city don't include a basic duplex. So we think that along Tyler Avenue, we could create standards that allow for more of these types of housing to be done compatibly and in a way that would improve the character of the neighborhood. Next slide, please. We included a kind of gallery of examples in the comprehensive plan of housing types that already exist in the city today, most of which would not be permitted within their zoning. So these are great examples of the kinds of things that we would love to see on Tyler Avenue if we could find a way to formalize those. Just very modest, multifamily type housing that really kind of says neighborhood, and community, and nothing that seems particularly out of scale. In fact, that in talking with Alderman,
is it really focused on multifamily, or have you thought about things like taking those larger lots and allowing them to be subdivided into smaller lots with smaller minimum lot sizes for starter type homes, or are you really envisioning multifamily?
no, that scenario that you describe is exactly something we would like to encourage. Cottage court, tiny home type of development. In fact, Alderman Gay, when he shared his interest in this, he referenced a group of narrow row homes that are off of Smithville Street on Johnson Place, and some of you might be familiar with those. I mean, there's lots of other examples of those in downtown, like the ones on Pinckney Street that you can see on the lower right of this slide. So that was...
There's a set off First Street in Eastport too.
Yeah, exactly, right. By Jeremy's Way there. So that those are attached, but you're talking about small detached homes. That's exactly like something that we would want to encourage. I mean, I think we get requests occasionally from folks who want to know how they can do that. They have the land, it's just not permitted in their zone.
Right.
So I think this is a way to test out.
It requires smaller lot sizes, perhaps smaller setbacks, but something that you could build, a nice 900 square foot home on. But what we would think of as a starter house kind of thing.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think we're going to have to, and Bob brought this up earlier. Alderman Gay reinforced this. The intent is definitely not to create a scale of housing that is out of character with what's there today. We're not trying to create, anything that's going to shadow neighbors. It's really about creating more granular, finer scale of housing types that utilizes the land better and creates more variety of housing. So that's really the goal.
Right.
Next slide, please. Streetscape safety is a big need on Tyler Avenue. Various folks in different departments have been looking at this for some time, and nothing has really happened from it. It's kind of a drag race corridor. You know, it's just a straight shot. There's really nothing to slow people down aside from a kid crossing the street that a driver might not see. So, during school hour or when school lets out and starts in the morning, you have crossing guards. But other than that, we don't have a streetscape that really encourages safe driving or pedestrian or bike activity. And we highlight complete streets in the comprehensive plan. So we think that within the standards for this overlay district, we could require a different type of streetscape improvements that would really help to create a better street environment, more safe street environment. So that would be a goal. Next slide, please. And then finally, I really didn't want to put in an image of what good neighborhood character looks like, because it's really, it varies from place to place. But here are some of the bullet points from the comprehensive plan as they applied to performance standards for mixed-use development. Now, we're talking here about more residential development, but I thought these 4 bullet points actually could relate pretty well to a residential neighborhood. These are the kind of things we want to be mindful of. And you can see an image of Tyler Avenue today. It's real mixed pattern of development. Fences that come right up to a sidewalk. The sidewalk's right up to the curb. There's no real continuity or consistency. So we could certainly do better. Parking lots that are right adjacent to the sidewalk. So these are the kind of things that are going to be on our mind as we think about standards.
When we redevelop any area in the city now, we do now encourage or somehow enforce like pushing back the sidewalk from the street, do we?
It's really case by case, honestly. And that's yes, we do.
Yeah.
But it relies on staff basically doing the right thing. It's not codified, unfortunately. Yeah. It's,
because like where I live, being a newer development, the older developments around me, and I live in an infill area, all the sidewalks are abutted a very speedy road. And then where my development is, it comes, like 3-4 feet off of the road and there's a strip of grass, right? Mm-hmm. Would love to see that eventually extended in all new development or any redevelopment or anything like this, but then also trees to line if possible.
I can tell you that any new development that is coming in on Upper West Street, and there are some, it's because of our adopted comprehensive plan. Yep. We have when I have to review any project is a major site plan or a special exception. And I can use the goals of the comprehensive plan to say, you should be moving that sidewalk away from the curb and creating a buffer there, because it's just, we're not going to create that pedestrian environment without doing that. And so it is not the first instinct for nearly every application that comes in is just keeping the sidewalk exactly as it is. We have to tell them to do that, to change it.
This is with the Bush Library, it does that as well, where up against the side or up against the road, and then it goes where the new library is, it goes, a couple feet away.
Yeah.
So in my mind, my hope is that, there's no way to like snap our fingers and make everything get corrected this way. But anytime you have redevelopment or tearing up sidewalks or anything like that, that we can try to encourage it is really a safety buffer for pedestrians.
Yeah. Yeah, we absolutely need to do that.
It has to go into BCE, MX, and future form-based stuff.
Right. So I think some of what we come up with for Tyler Avenue will be applicable. I think it's going to be a really good test of what we can
And
do.
also, anything that comes before us in the meantime,
Yeah. Okay, next slide. So, tell me if you can't deal, but I want to go through, this next phase is where we get into those consolidated zones. So I want to give you an update on where that is, because we listened to we heard you at the last meeting. So if you go to the next slide, I shared at the beginning this map that talked about kind of the low-hanging, the zones that we felt were really obsolete and redundant, or just not yielding the kind of results that we wanted. C2A, B3CD were some examples. One of the points that you made was, why are you not focusing on some of these, we weren't really touching some of the places where we identified major infill redevelopment opportunities. And a lot of those fell into the B1, the B2, the B3 zones. Those are commercial zoning districts. So we made a decision that, yes, we should be including those. So if you go to the next slide, because if our goal is to promote high-quality mixed-use development on our major corridors, it's hard to neglect the B1, B2, and B3 zoning districts.
When we're talking about B zones, just across the board, is there any reason that you can think of why a area zoned for business, commercial only, should not also be mixed use?
No. In fact, that's actually is exactly what we're getting at. Okay. Because we came to that determination. But I think what we realize is we've been very single-mindedly thinking about mixed use. There are places where having ground floor retail does make sense. And you think about 4th Street in Eastport, some of these historic commercial, like Main Street, Annapolis Street in West Annapolis. There's some corner store locations. All of those places make sense to have ground floor retail or commercial, active commercial of some kind. But then you could have residential above or some other use, offices or something. So yeah, so if you go to the next slide.
And especially if we want to support our local businesses, having a built-in clientele that can just easily get there, right?
Right.
So I would really love to see, as we are working our way through the zoning area, that if there's not, unless it's like an industrial area that has that kind of problem where you don't want people living nearby, like that would make sense, right? That's the whole reason why zoning kind of got started in the first place, was uninhabitable areas because they were industrialized. We don't really have that through almost any part of the city that I can think of. And so it'd be great if we could move towards all business areas being rezoned so that they can facilitate mixed use.
Yeah, glad you're saying that. What you'll see here is we overlaid the major infill sites that were identified in the comprehensive plan. Those are the red outlines. So even though we're not hitting all of them by adding the B zones, you can see we are hitting quite a few of them. That includes the end of Forest Drive where it becomes Bay Ridge Road, West Annapolis Shopping Center, Eastport Shopping Center, the Annapolis Seafood Market site, and site across the street from that. So, we are picking up some of these, but I think that the big takeaway is that looking at our major corridors, these B zones really are a major component of those major corridors, so we have to really look at those critically. Next slide, please. So what we kind of come up with is this gradient here, where if we're trying to make more of our properties in the city that might be zoned for just office use or just general commercial use, more mixed use, there's this gradient of intensity and density of uses. It goes from more to less. At one end, you have BCE, which is, think of that as Upper West Street and Chinkapin, Round Road area. The other end, you could think of the development on Forest Drive, where the Village Greens development is. It's very low density. It still is somewhat suburban, but it has an opportunity to include more mixed use. In between those, you have what we think are a group of essentially existing or future mixed use. So the MX is existing, that's the inner West Street corridor. The C2 is existing, that's Main Street and Maryland Avenue, which we have, really high density, high intensity mixed use. And then the idea of consolidating B1, B2, and B3 to create kind of like a mixed use business focused zone. It's kind of what you're talking about, Commissioner. And we're showing an example of that in Eastport, but this would be, again, encourage or require ground floor commercial use with the potential to maybe have a floor or two of residential or some other use above it. So relatively small scale, granular type of development.
Require?
I think require at the ground floor. Here's, if you look at the MX zone, the intent with that was to have active ground floors. But there's a clause in there that gives a developer kind of an out. If they can't lease it within 6 months, they're able to have it be residential or something else. So I don't think any of us have the language yet, but I think if you really want to protect places that have commercial, the goal is really to prevent places that have historically been commercial or as value to the neighborhood from becoming 100% residential. That's the kind of the goal. We're really housing focused.
Uptown at Murray Hill.
Uptown Murray Hill, yeah, the sort of brownstone row houses. That's the example.
Yeah, those were originally supposed to be active and commercial on the first floor, right? But there just wasn't any market for it at the time.
That's my understanding, and I don't know the whole history, but yeah.
In that situation, can it revert back to first floor being commercial? There's nothing stopping it from
I
reverting
don't
back?
think so. No.
I think flexibility.
In
Sorry,
that
go ahead.
particular case, there are covenants in the development that preclude it. I don't think the zoning does, but the covenants.
That makes sense. Yeah. I can believe that.
It's a whole sorted affair.
Okay.
Got it.
I
Yeah,
remember correctly.
I think that it would make sense to protect at least the ability that if something is not able to be used for commercial when they come in initially, that it remains a flexible space that it can go back to commercial when there is a market for that, right? And so that covenants or anything like this cannot be precluded from coming back.
It just makes it resilient to economic changes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good comment. Okay. Next slide, please. So we looked at the B1, B2, B3, just to give you an overview. It sounds like you kind of are already on board where we're going with this, but just quickly walk through. Next slide, please. The B1 was designed to be this, what was called a convenient shopping district. So Annapolis Street in West Annapolis is B1. The businesses were, well, there's not so many businesses anymore, but we're VIN 909, the barber shop, I think there's a nail salon on Bay Ridge Avenue in Eastport, and then along 6th Street where there's a gallery and a new restaurant coming in. These are B1 districts, so relatively compact commercial locations. Next slide, please. The B2, sorry, I should have just gone straight to this. It gives you a sense of what this looks like. This is what we're going to do for these next few slides, going to go through, give you some example of this. Next slide, please. B2, think of larger shopping center locations, big box. Not all, but many are large shopping centers with large surface parking lots. Although 4th Street is also part of this. Next slide, please. So here's some examples. West Annapolis, Parole, Bay Ridge Road, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. And then next slide, please.
Real quick question. So
Yeah.
that area that you just showed,
Okay.
that's where the Walgreens that just went out, right?
No, actually, this is, the Walgreens in West Nap next to Growls is, the top image is actually,
That's Grawls. Okay.
that's Growls. Yeah, I know, it is actually deceptive because it's so far out, but
Now I see. Now I
Yeah.
see. Okay.
yeah. But that shopping center is also, oh wait, actually, no, that's BCE?
Yeah, the Parole place.
Where the cannabis dispensary is?
Yeah, that's B2, right?
BCE, yeah.
BCE.
So that shopping center you're talking about where the Walgreens just closed is BCE, yeah.
But that's part of what we're changing up, right?
Yeah, I mean, so we would, well, not exactly. I mean, we would be looking at ways of making the BCE maybe a better zone, but like, it's not a B1 or a B2 or a B3, so it's.
It's just a super inefficient use of that land right now.
It is, yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Sure. Next slide, please. Finally, the B3 general commercial, this is probably the most vague. It's kind of like everything else. Now, there's just two locations in the city, two areas that fit, that are in this zoning district. One is the building that houses the True Value hardware store on Forest Drive and several other businesses. Oh yeah, go, and then next slide. This is what it is. That building in the bottom, and then top where the Mercedes dealership is, and Long and Foster and Homes for America on the approach the Spot Creek Bridge. That's B3. So if you go to the next slide, we looked at the uses we've kind of been looking at for different mixed use, ideal mixed use scenarios. Like top are residential types that are allowed, residential uses, and the bottom in the orange are the various commercial or retail uses. So no problem with the commercial retail. I mean, most of them are permitted. Some are subject to standards. With the residential, it's kind of where we want it to be. We want to encourage residential above commercial. But the B3 permit that by right. There's no multifamily, single family attached, single family detached, and it's by design. It's basically saying we don't want to encourage 100% residential in places that make sense as commercial. So we can combine them, but we'd prefer to have the commercial on the ground floor and residential above. Next slide, please. But there are varied standards between these three. We looked at the differences, and there's no height limit, for example, in the B2 or B3, only in the B1. You have some requirement for business on the ground floor in the B1 and B2, but not the B3. So there's some kind of differences here that we want to reconcile. If you go to the next slide, there's a few other key things to note. Parking is regulated to the rear and side in the B1. So think about Annapolis Street, like Main Street corridor. You don't want surface parking in front of the building because it discourages pedestrian use. So that's great, but it doesn't exist in the B2 or B3. Ground floor residences, not allowed in B3, but they could be live workspace and actually B1 or B2. And I think that the key here, what we're trying to get at is that we think there's a need to retain a business district that encourages mixed use, but achieves all those goals that we have in our comprehensive plan. And when you look at the standards for these zones, they're not all perfect today. So we're really trying to create something that can be perfect. I don't use that word very often, but we have the ability to create a B zone that can really achieve better outcomes. And some of these buildings preceded the zoning, it's fair to say, but if these locations were developed tomorrow, we would want different outcomes. They all have deficiencies in some way. Next slide, please. And so finally, just to close, we showed you focus areas the last time we met. The Germantown, Homewood, and the West Annapolis locations are still our priorities for putting into action some of these ideas. These are places where we've already heard from residents a desire for change to bring about, more retail to serve the neighborhood, housing options, walkable places. So we really want to focus on, this is the current zoning in each of these locations. It's a mix of different zones. Next slide, please. So if you look at West Annapolis, next slide. We basically, I'm not going to dwell on this. It's a little bit hard to read. It's a lot, but we're looking at the existing zones that are there, the B1, the B2, the P, the PM. They all are missing various things to kind of create more of a mixed-use place. Next slide. There are buildings there today that could be adapted to be better mixed use, medical office buildings that are essentially mixed use today, but may not be serving the neighborhood as well as they could be. I'm not saying anything wrong with medical office buildings, but if that use was tomorrow less viable, a building like this could be adapted fairly easily if the zoning allowed for the kind of uses that were flexible. So next slide, please. So we looked at, on the left, existing zoning. On the right was a study we did in 2021 during the comprehensive plan process that looked at if we were to change this kind of awkward puzzle of zoning on the left to something that was responding better to neighborhood conditions, we might end up with something more like on the right, where you preserve the Village Main Street along Annapolis Street, you acknowledge that Raoul Boulevard is a higher volume corridor for vehicles. You preserve your shopping center in some configuration. Everybody wants the grocery store there, not go away. And then in between, you have a kind of transition zone. So that made a lot of sense to residents. Next slide, please. So if we take that, we look at kind of developments we want to see represent there, the kind of precedents. One on the right is actually there today, relatively new development. Next slide. And so this is this is not a final recommendation, but this is basically looking at how we could simplify the zones there in a way that would respond to what the neighbor is looking for. BCE would be along Raoul Boulevard, higher density corridor. The MX would be along Ridgely, where you kind of have a transition zone. And then along Annapolis Street, we would have this new business-focused MX zone that sort of tries to preserve what's on Annapolis Street today in terms of the character. Ground floor commercial with residential above, ideally. Next slide, please. And so quickly, Germantown Homewood. Next slide. It's a little more simple, I think, here, where we have some neighborhood conservation zoning already in place. We want to keep that. We're really just looking to transition the zones that are in purple and red. That's professional mixed on the north side of West Street, that B3CD on the south side. And then we have a few anomalies. In orange, we have an R4 that we want to transition to a neighborhood conservation. That's that little stretch of row homes on Johnson Place. It's a character development we want to preserve. So that little kind of square orange is that location. And then along Spa Road, as you approach Westgate Circle, there's a group of townhouses. They're kind of mixed architecture types. That goes from, I think,
R3R to R3.
R3R, which was a revitalization form of R3. We just want to remove that and just make it straight R3, just kind of simplify it. So MX is really the main idea along West Street to really encourage a highly walkable corridor, something like, Inner West Street. It's an extension of Inner West Street, basically. Next slide. So next steps, next slide, please. We're going to be planning some public outreach for these immediate items, the plan development updates and the Tyler Avenue Overlay District, March or April, probably both, but try to start as quickly as possible. Next. And then when we get back to you, I think this actually, I meant to update this slide. So we're actually, this will probably be pushed off. This slide actually is meant to focus on the phase 1 plan development and Tyler Avenue overlay. What we're showing you here, this is kind of a teaser. When we get back into looking at the zoning consolidation, we're going to be bringing to you some graphics that can start to look at what does the zoning allow today and what would the future zoning allow from a bulk perspective, to give you some better perspective on, and the community, importantly, like what really would the outcome be? It's hard to sometimes know, but because there's some flexibility built in, but this is the kind of stuff that actually, we're going to be looking at this for Tyler Avenue as a kind of first step. So it'll probably play out into the zoning consolidation work too. But next slide. I think that's it. Yeah. So thanks for your patience.
Where applicable, so you said you're going to show us kind of what we have today and then what we're looking at for the future. Where applicable, I would love to also have a third part, which is what has historically been built there. And what I mean by that is, if we had our downtown area for some reason destroyed, earthquake or something, right? We would not legally be allowed to build it again the way it is. The zoning doesn't allow for it. And so if we did what zoning we are allowed today versus the future, oftentimes I think we're going to miss the fact that some of the best parts of our city that people love the most are actually not legal to build today.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the visualizations as you go out into the community are going to become really important. Casey's going to be prime, he's going to be the prime producer of this stuff. And that's what's nice about form-based is that you can visualize what's there. The uses are just not that important anymore. I'm not concerned. Anyway, there's a lot to be gone through here.
Yeah, I think that at your next meeting, we're going to have some real stuff, some real recommendations for you to kind of chew on.
Okay, because now several of us have been through this now a couple times.
I know.
Okay.
It's getting
So you can start to
repetitive.
pick up, okay,
Yeah.
and where we left off.
Yeah.
All right,
All right.
keep it up.
All right.
We're getting there. We're going to get there.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, good. This is great. But you all be good.
The city website if you want to look at it later.
We are going to be posting this presentation.
If I could make one recommendation when we, either when we ask questions of the public or we put things out for the public to view, so many people I talk to just like never check the city website, right? I mentioned this previously to a couple others. It would be fantastic if we have surveys or the Survey 123 or anything like this that we do, Survey 123 creates a QR code. We can get that on a sticker and post that in a couple of public locations because everyone knows now how to use a QR code, right? I think we get a lot more people than when we just post the survey link on the government website or on Facebook.
We've been doing that a lot more when we did like the public water access plan.
Oh,
and
perfect.
when we did the 2040 plan, when we did the surveys, like we had the printouts with
Yep.
QR code in the bottom. corner.
Awesome, thank you.
That's something I would have thought of. All right. Well, thank you. All right. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right. All in favor of that? Aye. Good work.
It's a wrap.
Huh?
All right, see you guys soon.